This is the first lecture. I don't want this thing. Yeah, I don't want this thing. This is the first lecture in the lecture series this semester. We typically have a lecture every Tuesday, but sometimes we have them on Thursday, like we do this week. You can always be sure when there's going to be a lecture. If you go down the stairs and you look directly in front of you, there's a gigantic poster that has the name of the lecturer, the date that they're lecturing, the time that they're lecturing, the city that they're from, everything. It's all right there. So just if you have any doubt, just look on either side. But typically they're Tuesdays and Thursdays. There's one tonight. You're here. We know that. There's one on Thursday. I'm just going to just give you just a quick overview of the lecture series this semester. We have a lot of terrific lecturers coming in. Some will give a lecture and then a workshop, and some will be here for two events. So tonight, I'm not going to introduce the lecturer because I'm going to introduce someone in a minute who is going to introduce the lecturer. So I'm not going to introduce the lecturer. I will tell you that this Thursday, there's another lecture at 5:30. We switched the times to 5:30 this year. Do you like that better? We're trying to please. That's good. 5:30 is better time. All right. Michael Pung is going to be lecturing here Thursday. He's also going to do a workshop on Friday with graduate students. He's the project architect at Gensler who did the Shanghai Tower. It's the tallest building in China, and he's going to do a lecture on that building and on many of the tall buildings at Gensler that he's been involved with, but specifically on that one. And he's also going to give a workshop the next day on parametric design and facades in tall buildings. On the 27th, the next lecture is Annabelle Seldorf. If you don't know her work, you should. She's a graduate of the school. She gave our graduation convocation lecture last year. You can see it online. If you go to the video archive, you can see it. She gave a terrific lecture. She's giving the Seligman lecture this year. It's a very important lecture. But that's on the 27th. Roger Sherman, who's a VC, is lecturing on the 29th. Na Hui will lecture on the 4th of October, and she will also give two different workshops, because she'll be here for most of the week. Panos Dragonis will lecture on the 18th of October, and he's a scholar at Princeton this semester, but he's actually on faculty at a university in Greece, I don't remember. Julian Manriquez Mateo will lecture next, and he's a VC this semester. James Corner will give a university lecture on the 10th of November. Every year the university organizes a series of lectures with super big people who come in, and all those lectures are at Hendricks Chapel. So that lecture will be in Hendricks Chapel, but we will do an event here at 2 p.m. on that same day. So you can come and join that. And then the last lecture of the year is by Julian de Schmidt, who's a Belgian architect who was originally Bjarke Ingels' partner in a firm called Plot. And he will be doing a VC for us next semester, so you might want to see his lecture. Okay, thank you all for coming. We will on occasion have receptions after the lectures. You'll be able to figure that out in the poster. So welcome to the semester. Welcome to the lecture series. I'm going to now introduce Danielle Profeta, who's going to give the introduction to the speaker tonight, who's Georgina Huljich. But he's going to tell you all about her. Danielle, you can clap for him.
I'm going to use this one. Okay, so it is with great honor that I introduce today Georgina Huljich as our first guest for the fall lecture series, as Michael just described, here at Syracuse University School of Architecture. She's, for me, both a mentor and a dear... It's not working?
It sounds quiet.
Okay. as I was saying, she's both a mentor and a dear friend to me, a continuous source of inspiration for both my personal and professional life. Georgina is a principal at Patterns with Marcelo Spina, which you might already know, an architectural design practice based in Los Angeles, which gained international recognition for its unique approach to architecture. Reading from one of the introductory essays from their latest monograph, Embedded Patterns, it is helpful to understand the complexity of their body of work. And here I'm quoting: "The articulation of difference within a more compound whole generates what could be thought of as an architectural ecotones, transitional zone between two ecological communities. It is working within the sensibility of an architectural ecology, which requires a precise understanding of balance and imbalance. Their work seamlessly integrates advanced technology within an extensive consideration of form, novel tectonics, and innovative materials. They completed projects across multiple scales, programs, and cultures in the US, South America, and Asia, and their work was exhibited and published worldwide, and has received numerous prizes and awards, including grants from the Ground Foundation in Chicago, and the prestigious United States Artist Gregor Fellowship, among others. Georgina has previously worked at the Guggenheim Museum and Dean Wolf Architects in New York, as project designer at Morphosis. She has lectured extensively in the United States and internationally, and has held visiting, teaching, and critic positions at several institutions, including Yale, Berkeley, Tokyo Institute of Technology, etc., etc. She's an adjunct professor and director of the UCLA UD summer program, and at the University of California in Los Angeles. So please join me to welcome Georgina Huljich for today's lecture.
Okay, thanks so much, Daniele, for the very kind introduction, and thank you, Michael, for inviting me. I have to say that you took my bench. So you can take my seat there. Thank you very much. Oh, no. Is this better? Maybe too high? Okay. So thanks for the bench, Michael, and it's really an honor for me to be here. I have to say that I truly feel like, I know, almost like being home. And so I must say that it's been a little bit hard to think about how to, what to show in this lecture and how to structure it when my partner, Marcelo Spina, that I don't know, maybe some of you met, presented our work here exactly 2 years ago. Needless to say, all the work that I'm going to be showing you guys today, is in collaboration with Marcelo and all the talented people that has worked in our office for the last 15 years, including our colleagues Daniele and Maya. And as much as architecture takes time, and I don't think that much can be accomplished in 2 years within. Okay, is that better? Okay. I will leave the bench when my high heels are, okay. So, as much as architecture, we cannot necessarily accomplish much within 2 years, within the built realm, there are a series of interests that we have in the office that, I don't know, maybe for the last 3 or 4 years, which have now evolved and are beginning to be deeply embedded within the work itself. So looking in retrospective, I guess I'm old enough to say that I can look into my work in some retrospective, or maybe in better words, in a projective retrospective, and looking at the evolution of our practice in the last 2 years, I decided to organize the work through a series of, or through a set of interests, or sometimes, simply through some circumstances, but also different contexts from which we operated. So This is maybe just one of the many different ways I could look back and talk about the work. So I warn you, in 2 years, maybe the statement might change and the narrative might be slightly different. But then as of today, the first segment of the lecture then will refer to 4 buildings that we completed between 2004 and 2013, which I will categorize them as being part of a global project. So just to give you a little bit of a background, we started our practice trying to establish kind of like a global approach to the problem of architecture. And the reason I am calling this a global approach has to do, or a global project has to do, in fact, with many of the preoccupations that we had. At that moment, they were all quite similar, yet they were all executed in very different environments and very different contexts. So we were challenged to work across different cultures, different geographies, different programs, yet we had a very deep interest in trying to position one idea, or at least, some of the interest that we had at the moment, that of maybe a certain will of change, but within with the inflections and the differences that will be promoted by operating in very different contexts, and why not conforming to them as well. So at that moment, the main premises had to do with problems of plasticity, problems of forming, inflection, and torsion, almost, or mainly I would say, how to insert a certain kind of newness in typologies that are highly established, as it is, for example, the domestic context of a single family house. This is in Rosario in Argentina, or for example in the context of a commercial building or a commercial space in a highly transited and iconic portion of Los Angeles, as it is the Sunset Boulevard in the heart of West Hollywood, or in the context at that moment, very isolated place in China. Well, not anymore, because now there are many developments going on, but almost like a pseudo generic hybrid office building that was in the outskirts of the city. Or, taking it all the way back to Argentina, in a vertical apartment building with a very strong typological condition, as it was a Jujuy Redux project also in Rosario in Argentina. But why these projects were important, or at least important to us, they were important because they establish a global view. Even though the work looks quite cohesive, somebody might argue it doesn't, but I think it does. All 4 projects differ very drastically, not just one, but I would say at many levels. And this is in relation to, for example, different modes of construction, different materials, different context, different audience, different user, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in the FYF house in Argentina, the idea was to conceive the entire project as a very monolithic, solid, almost a monochromatic form that is punctuated with very subtle inflections that establish, almost like a physical relationship between the different interior spaces, but at the same time keeps a sense of identity and privacy between them. It's ultimately a house, so that was a requirement from the client. But then the idea of working with a concrete shell, as you might suspect this is, was threefold. It first allowed for a degree of plasticity and fluidity in the surfaces that otherwise it would have been impossible to achieve, or at least with the technology that we had in Argentina. Secondly, and this is also characteristic of construction processes in Argentina, is the fact that labor is much cheaper than materials, so it was actually much more affordable to work with a concrete shell instead of using any other system of construction. So, and finally, but in this case, maybe talking about the actual properties of the concrete as material, both, the very smoothness and the porosity that the material promotes, the porosity, also the color, the texture, allowed for a very monochromatic reading that, an abstract reading that we were actually quite interested in achieving. The house is also sitting in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you can see a little bit through the context, through the window. So the project used a very intrinsic logic of organization and circulation of a single family house to conceive its external volume. So all the, I mean, in a way, all the logic for it came from its very intrinsic principles. And very similar ideas took place in the Prism Gallery. This is in Los Angeles, in West Hollywood, where we were creating very subtle sensations by inducing material and why not, I mean, some kind of like optical dynamism through the envelope, but in this case, instead of being from or happening from an intrinsic aspect of the building or the program itself, it had much more to do with the high profile condition of the context, as it is the Sunset Strip, with challenged in a way and enhanced the pedestrian and vehicular movement along the street. So the project in this case also presented the possibility of working with a true material innovation, since it was going to be the first facade in the nation to be constructed entirely out of a resin-based composite material. So, so we moved from the almost like the very analog concrete shell in the house in Argentina to, in this case, the high-tech plastic forming and absolute control on the composition of the material itself. And now we move, I mean, into, or we transport some of these ideas to this hybrid building in Chengdu, China. Hybrid, not just because of its program, it was or it is a headquarters building for a corporate office that included housing, also some recreational activities and offices and commercial spaces. But also it's a hybrid because of different construction methods that were all deployed within the same building. So in this case, manufacturing took place off-site, and then it was shipped over the site. And I have to say that, of course, I mean, if approaching or if being interested in this global approach, or the global approach that, I mean, in a way begin to cluster all these projects together, which, I mean, has been and continues to be a very important concern in our office. This is, I think, deeply rooted in the idea of taking elements that belong to the very local conditions of a project, a site, its culture, to then try to articulate that and involve them within a much more global order. So in this, like for example, interior circulation and low-tech methods of production took place in the house of Argentina, exterior circulation and movement with high technology in the gallery in Sunset Boulevard. And in this case, for the project in Chengdu, we use the idea of the topographic landscape of a golf course that was adjacent to the site, together with the privacy and the containment of the inner gardens from the traditional courtyards, which are actually so characteristic from Chinese culture. And all these intrinsic factors, in a way, began to conceive some ideas of the project. So the mass then exposes, I mean, the global problem that is also recurrent in these other projects in other places, the problem of the torsion and plasticity, and almost like a sensibility towards like trying to challenge balance, trying to challenge weight and vision, while at the same time producing some oblique relationships between interior and exterior, also between the wall and the ceiling, and the discrete and the monolithic. The discrete was taking place at the edges of the mass, that was formulating almost like a diagonal throughout the building, and that was defined by a highly articulated surface made out of GFRC, which is glass fiber reinforced concrete. So, I mean, that was operating in contrast with the smoothness of the concrete that was negotiating the apertures with the vertical metal panels. We now go back to Rosario in Argentina, once again with the most analog way of doing things, and once again trying to challenge like very established typologies, in this case a multifamily apartment building. We didn't do this, but this is the normal housing building typology. Balconies are almost the inevitable cultural element in these kind of like mid-rise residential buildings. I would say, I mean, not just in Argentina, but maybe in South America. And typologically, balconies have become almost like a playground for formalism. But most likely, they usually neglect issues of spatial integration into an overall scheme. They're always, I mean, ornaments or add-on conditions into the facades of the buildings. And much worse, I think they disassociate themselves from both from social issues and from human inhabitation. So instead, of course, I mean, we will always argue that we are always that what we do is maybe better what was done before, but the formal and the spatial and all the material treatment of the balconies of our building, I would say, is one of the most significant and innovative and socially performative aspects of this project. I have to also clarify that this was a project done in collaboration with MSA architects, being Maxi Spina, why not the most instrumental person in the project. So, yeah, please note the horse carriage. If going back to the contrast and the dichotomies that a global approach implies, not sure we will see one of them on Sunset Boulevard, maybe for a movie, but not beyond that. And here, I mean, you can see how the balconies begin to acquire such an important role, mainly because they define like the very fine line that allow for the manipulation of the mass, both at the scale of the overall volume, but also at the scale of each of the apartments. They allowed, in a way, the building to break up the existing typology, or the known typology of these type of buildings, by incorporating the balconies within the logic of the mass, instead of defining them purely by the extension of the slab, which again, I mean, is what we know. So the monochromatic condition of the building, I mean, in this case, to emphasize differences in material texture, so it was all painted in white, and which has allowed black and white outfits to walk by. You can see there, I'm not sure what happened with the pink t-shirt, though, but you can see, yeah, some of the interior conditions, at least at the level of the street. The balconies operating as pockets, completely integrated within the mass of the building. So, well, I've been talking with my students a lot about this, so guys, I might maybe repeat some of the things, but I think it's always good to hear them twice or three times. But the nude icons era for us, and by era maybe that's too ambitious, I mean, it was just a series of interests or it is a series of interests that we have in our office, but it was mainly originated as a need to try to adapt to the current status of our culture and our world, where, I mean, why not, I guess global forces were certainly at stake and intervening at the very core of what we do as architects. So this is I mean, in a way, this is something that has always been at stake in a way, but now I think there is the peculiar necessity to neutralize formal expression and adopt a much more, I would say, much more modest attitude towards context. So I think it's also important for me to talk about this in the context not just of our practice, but also in the context of the work that I'm developing with the students in our BC studio, so as to bring also these two worlds of a professional practice and academia together and demonstrate in a way, or make the argument of how deeply interrelated they are. So if thinking about I know, all the processes that took place after September 11, like global warming, well, that's been happening from before too, but then the financial collapse, and again, all the implications of almost like a new era of austerity and why not social consciousness and engagement. Of course, I mean, these all had huge implications in the way that we would define the icon. So the fundamental question was, I mean, what constitutes a relevant icon nowadays? You all know that most recently the comment by the Chinese premier saying that he didn't want to have more weird buildings, addressing the OMA CCTV a project as one of them. So, but then what does it mean in a way, what does it mean for architecture to face both like cultural and political criticism that seems in a way seems to push backwards. So we believe, and I believe, that in the continuity and in the importance and the relevance of the icon, in a way we need to address it, and we have to accept that it has come under stress, and in a way we need to reimagine it. So, but what does it mean to reimagine the icon? Of course, I mean, doesn't, or to me, it has nothing to do with going back to either parametricism, where I think, some ideas of parametricism tend to maybe emphasize almost like a certain thread in a certain global trend that maybe, we could be slightly critical about. It also doesn't mean going back to deconstructivism either. But certainly, and this is the one that I would be most critical about, it has nothing to do with going back to almost like the most aberrant POMO ideas, where the building operates as a sign and the image and the building are completely separated one from the other. So, and I think this is a very important point to clarify, and I think this is a good metaphor to explain my point better. Here you can see, there is a diagram of a cloud that was done by a meteorologist, which as you see, is a bunch of dots, and what's important within that diagram is that, for example, the distances between the dots, the density of the dots, the size of the dots, they're all defined by parameters. Basically, this is proposing the problem of the cloud almost as a field, and ultimately it is talking about the material composition of the cloud. Then the one to the right talks about the shape of the cloud. So this is about the shape and the outline. And the other one is the image of the cloud, which is the photo of the cloud. But none of these things is less real than the other ones. They're all real things. One is real because you know that it's real, because it's a photo, no doubt about that. But the other ones are also as real as a photo. We get the parametric cloud, as it is the cloud or the diagram with particles. Then we get the postmodern cloud, which begins to translate the cloud as an image, and then the image of the cloud, which is the image of the cloud. But can we actually try to put all these things together? So our interest in dichotomies and mute icons then brings us to an interest in this kind of images. Images that are partially transparent and partially opaque, images that in their like almost vagueness promote newness, and in their strangeness they promote a kind of forward-looking idea of what the culture of the image can be. So I believe that the image and the building can indeed be together. So this is a, maybe too loud, but I guess it's okay. This is the image of the opening sequence for True Detective. How can I make it? No? Oh, perfect. Okay. So, so in a very weird way, and by any means I'm trying to imply that this operates as a direct transfer to how architecture operates. But in an interesting way, here context and subject that all collapse together to try to convey like a very strange and a stronger, I would say, deeper narrative, and yet to obfuscate the image in itself. But basically what you see are two different images that are flickering off each other, and they're producing a third thing, which is kind of, I mean, in this case, maybe diabolic or I know, like too strange, but we cannot completely recognize. Like we don't know exactly what each of them are, but they're working together to produce something that is as strong as mute. That was loud. So these are some of the observations in relation on how we understand a mute icon. I'm not going to get into them very specifically, since I prefer to touch on these perceptions in terms of how they relate. They relate to the work that we are producing right now, instead of trying to make like a whole theoretical argument about each of them. But then, for example, ideas of indeterminacy and instability, in this case involving almost like the impossibility of easily reading and situating objects, both within their own context, but also in relation to other objects. Idea of monolithicity and relative autonomy. Then, incongruity, after 2 decades of interest in a informal continuity and incremental variation, I think it's time where we can push for these discontinuities and ruptures, and in a way deep changes in kind. Ideas of adjacency and disparity, physical abstraction, where, for example, form becomes much more dominant over assembly. In a way, its materialization no longer relates by a series of connections of parts, but rather by the very physical abstraction of all these, of all the parts that belong to that whole, if put in the context of traditional building processes. Fuzziness, I think this is quite important, and I'm bringing this up also in the context of the studio that I'm working with the students here. The idea of surface articulation and almost like indiscriminate ornamentation, I think to me has become, or to us has become a cliche, and they represent a contemporary sign of formal and why not aesthetic weakness. So in order, to in a way preserve and further emphasize ideas of mass, I think we should stop right before any trace of ornamentation and surface articulation, or right before they become figurally apparent. So when referring to mute icons, and I guess I've been saying the word too many times, as architects we don't make icons. We make buildings and we make projects, and culture sometimes then transforms them into icons. And I think this is a very important distinction to make because even though, again, I'm referring to the word icon a lot, I'm referring mainly to an idea of an icon. I am not necessarily suggesting that everything we do or that we make, I mean, as architects, I'm not talking about my office, but as architects, that everything will become an icon, but there are some traces or some aspects of specific projects and certainly how they actually apprehend or how they're actually used, how they are seen and how they're actually absorbed by culture, and I think that's what makes them, potentially icons. So, in the case of League of Shadows, this is a project in Los Angeles, where again our colleague Daniele Profeta was instrumental in the design and construction of this project. It wouldn't have happened without him. What's interesting for us is that it is a building that somehow, even though it's a pavilion project, because it was done within the context of a graduation pavilion, it's actually a very large one, and one that had in its DNA both, I would say the idea of both, like using a shape that would actually cast its own shadow one time of the year when the graduation ceremony would take place. So that would make it a very functional apparatus, which, I would claim that many architects have done extremely good jobs and terrific projects approaching these ideas, but I think they failed to the very simple idea of keeping 1,000+ people 2 hours under shade and with some breath and some air in the space. So I think that this project has not only achieved that, but has done so by taking the least amount of parking in an area where parking is extremely necessary, and also producing a beacon in a campus, in the campus of SCI-Arc, in a very important corner. So it is an institutional beacon where we envision to have the brand of the school. Of course, needless to say, I had conflicted feelings about this in some faculty at UCLA, but well, a project is a project. So this is a kind of a mute view from the street, in contrast with a much more patterned and textured view from the interior, also people beginning to texture the ground, and the very clear tripartite outline and how it relates to the context and with downtown LA in the background. So what's interesting about this is that, for example, these are photos that we no longer own. These are a collection of images that just happen in places like Instagram or other social media, or that former students sent to us. And for example, this is a recent photo that was taken by a former student that happened the day of the Santa Clarita fire in Los Angeles, which shows a very dystopic view of the structure in the, almost in the midst of something that is completely unforeseen. So, so this is not the parametric cloud, this is not the postmodern cloud, or the actual image. I know, maybe this suggests the fourth category, I'm not sure yet. And you know this movie, it's a very transited artery in Los Angeles. In this case, the project just appears on the site. You see there. Not a big fan of the movie, but you could see the sort of presence that the project produces. This is all about location, 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 and just because it's there, it appears. And which it's an important strategy for architects. Not that we knew that it was going to happen, but we kind of thought that it could be the case. So in this case, it's even more interesting. I'm sure you know the movie, in the Fear of the Walking Dead, because the project and the context are much more embedded in the actual narrative. You see downtown in flames. Kind of also a dystopic and apocalyptic setting. And interestingly enough, the building is part of the context, but they didn't even bother to burn it because I guess, I mean, it looks already burned. So, but it's there. It didn't burn, and we're still happily sitting there. So, I mean, in a way, if we were to, if I were to test our own assumptions and our own anxieties, I wanted to show you the current interest and the current production of the office through, actually through the projects themselves, a series of projects that range from scale, range from clients and interest, demands, finances, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a project that was commissioned by the Center for the Arts of Performance at UCLA. We are not doing the new building, but it's actually a table. And it's a table that is to be used in a series of dinners for patrons and artists, and even a very small piece. I think it's a very, it's a quite relevant, or it's a quite relevant project for us because not just for the institutional context that it comes from, but also for the challenge of testing ideas across scales, and especially one scale that we are not very familiar with, which is the one of furniture. It's also interesting for us that, like, through the abstraction or through abstraction in general, we think that we can get to problems of narrative, we can get to problems of engagement through the arts. In this case, I mean, this is an incredibly a successful program, as it is the Center for the Arts of Performance at UCLA, which is headed by Christy Edmonds, which, I mean, in a way gears towards a multidisciplinary approach to the performing arts. So we wanted to make a project that somehow would speak to these issues, and yet it would mute itself from any kind of like direct idea or any direct reference from either any of the arts or the artists themselves or even the event itself that it would take place, by producing something that in its own abstraction allows for multiple meanings and multiple possibilities to emerge. So our response to the brief was to try to make a table that, I mean, tensions or produces some tensions between the part and the whole, the part being a constituent part, a part of like a small, like rectangular pieces of wood that somehow would create, I mean, some striation that breaks the table into three portions, which, I mean, in this case had to do for storage and for transportation purposes, but also that allow for a group of people to use it in different ways and in very distinctive manners. So it could be combined in 2 or 3 different positions. So, but furthermore, I think the idea, I mean, you see some of the center pieces, they will constantly be constructed and deconstructed and reassemble. And this, I mean, in a way would begin to memorialize the event itself, intending to host artists or guests and patrons and allowing them to leave a memory. So, and the memory would be either by like rebuilding the table, by reconstructing it, or by leaving their mark. And the oblique projection, that in a way, I mean, allows us to understand new relationships between the parts. We started to produce this, I don't know, maybe some projects ago. Now it became almost like a habit and something actually a productive habit. With a similar sensibility, but at a completely different scale, and with a similar, I would say, preoccupation of part-to-whole relationship, but again, different context. This is in Lima, in Peru, and with a very different attitude towards the ground than the one of the table. Of course, I mean, ideas are not, cannot be scaled, and that's part of the challenge. But then this project was a response to a very particular brief that asked for the addition of a contemporary wing in the existing Lima Museum of Art in Peru. But I mean, there were some preservation issues, and because of having to build in the of the park, in a, I mean, it's an extremely congested corner, the building needed to be entirely underground. That was part of the competition brief. So, I mean, we thought it was a real and interesting conundrum of the brief, which basically, I mean, in a way, it put architecture or a limit architecture, political and social and formal agenda. But yet we wanted to, I mean, you know, still push and still take a position to see if we could actually bury a building in the ground, yet maintain a building formal or relative autonomy from the ground. So this is what we did. This is a church in Lalibela in northern Ethiopia. And I mean, it's a cruciform shape which is on the ground, but it's actually not connected to the ground. Of course, in our case, it had to be connected to the level of the street because of accessibility and continuity from the plaza. But I mean, in a way, we wanted to limit that connection in order to create voids and courtyards around the building that would assert that there was a building and that there is a building down there instead of just the continuation of underground levels from the existing building. So the building could still be understood as an object and not just as a pure continuation of the park, the plaza, and the existing museum urban surface. Landscape was proposed in phases, and again, I mean, now at this point, the oblique elevation became a habit. In our office, like now we've been almost as a rule, we are producing this type of images, which allows for almost like a not so apparent reading between the different components of the project. I mean, in this case, elevation and plan operating in the same plane, even though the building is completely buried. So this is a first disruption. I cannot categorize this yet, and I think, and by disruption, I guess, I mean, I'm attempting to theorize something that, I mean, we didn't really have yet. In this case, nature and the vernacular. I think this was the first project that began to propose some ideas about that. Or, I mean, we could take it to the idea of the typification of islands huts, or the idea of the informality of settings. I mean, again, this was quite new for us. But then our work was still based on organizational and geometric alignments to maintain a certain amount of control. So the idea of informality was still, I mean, trying to be quite controlled within those parameters. So this is a project in Bequia Island in the Caribbean. It's a luxury resort. This is a site, not bad. The brief of the project called for around 20 quays and several public amenities, and a very fluent relationship with the water, since most of the guests would arrive by waterplane or by boat. So, like, if we put some of these projects within or in contrast with some of our kind of like more urban projects, this is definitely much more informal, or has an informal organization. The plan is not even an issue. The plan would not communicate absolutely any conditions of the project. I mean, it's certain, there is a certain amount of looseness in the way that these blocks are actually, I mean, all combined and put together, descending from the hill, in order to try to maintain almost like a sense of informality, which is present in islands and villages in that area, but also using building typologies that are intrinsic to the site as they are the beach barn roofs. So what was also interesting about this project is the fact that our client is an English hotelier who owns a resort brand that is mainly dedicated to conquer exotic islands in the world. And what he's actually invested in selling is not necessarily a vacation or an atmosphere, but a lifestyle. So, so if responding to the specificities and the constraints of the project, but also, I mean, together with his own vision and the vision of the brand and the idea to promote luxury without necessarily manifesting it within the physical and material expression of the building, it became actually a very interesting or productive constraint for the project. And the beloved oblique plan, I mean, in this case, challenging the elevational outlines of the masses within the ground plane. So this is another project. It's another case of a way of new or a new way of developments that are taking place in and around Los Angeles, and that have to do with the densification. In this case, I mean, in the valley in North Hollywood, with recycling two existing buildings. One of them is currently being used, which is the bowstring truss. The site hosted a former supermarket. It's in the corner of Victory Boulevard, again in North Hollywood, and it's a very active and a very active artery and street in Los Angeles. This is very close to the San Fernando Valley. So our task had to do with, I mean, not only renovate the building, we had to add from 17,000 square feet to approximately 45,000 square feet, but also we had to reconsider the entire relationship of the building with the site, given that our client is interested in building a medical campus there, where the two buildings and the open spaces will, in the future, act in continuity. So the building has a single floor. It will incorporate a basement, a mezzanine, and in doing so, we started to think about carving out courtyards from the main volume in order to begin to create new relationships between the interior and the exterior. But also first create, I mean, a much larger opening by taking two modules, maybe here, by taking two modules of the existing building and then opening the parking from the back to the street, which actually all the people are going to be coming from that area. So, I mean, it begins to promote a new kind of urban context, creating kind of, I mean, small but yet a quite institutional public level, and a new frontage to the boulevard, which, I mean, was completely dead before, and then also articulating a new facade to the new green open space that will be used for, I mean, visitors and doctors and patients alike. So we re-articulated the facade by producing both almost like a sense of breaking down the scale by creating, I mean, a series of crystalline volumes that are both, I mean, independent and completely ingrained to the existing structure. So in elevation, you can see, I mean, how these modules are also, I mean, related to the bowstring structure. They're both contiguous with the existing structure that allows for this alignment. But also these cuts begin to reveal almost like a, I don't know, why not like a new life for both the existing sign that the client wanted to maintain as a kind of an iconic presence for the neighborhood. This is Wishing for Rain in Los Angeles. Then here you can see the basement, the ground level, basically that goes from the street all the way back to the parking and all the upper terraces and the offices that are for doctors and people working in the institution. So, I mean, what was rather a dead building and public space is now very active. So even though this is a commercial and healthcare facility, we see every opportunity to not just produce a building that may or may not maybe achieve the status of the icon, but then that engages the public and engages the community and does many of these things, yet produces also a forward-looking view of what architecture can do. I don't think that, I mean, for example, community engagement and form are necessarily opposed issues. So these are just fragments from the construction set. It is actually due to receive city permit in a couple of weeks. Keep close, because when it happens, I think we're going to be breaking ground immediately for now, I mean, it's our largest building in Los Angeles. And oblique, once again. So I started the lecture talking about global practices and a global approach, but the reality is that, I mean, we're lucky, we have the luck of being in a global city. But no matter how, as it is Los Angeles, but no matter how global the city is, I mean, in a way you still have to engage with the city for what it is at that specific moment and for what it is at that specific place and time, and understanding its constraints and forms and all its economies. So these are one of the, I would say, largest trends recently in projects that are actually geared to densify the urban core of the city area and areas that are right adjacent to them. This is so I'm going to show two last projects and maybe with two small disruptions, both of them in downtown Los Angeles with a scale that cannot, in a way, cannot be compared to any of the work that we have done before. But I would say similar to the table, but of course, I mean, in a completely different level, is another challenge for our office in our pursuit to work across different scales and understanding what it actually takes and what it actually needs. So the first project is right on the south side of downtown Los Angeles, almost in the intersection of the 10th and the 110th freeway. It's a 2 million square feet development, 2 contiguous blocks and 1 existing building, which is a black square that you see there. This is a project that we are collaborating with Gensler. There are a lot of things that, of course, I mean, one can say about these large projects. There are a lot of complexities that we didn't even know that they existed, and there are many different actors involved. But of course, I mean, they required, at least for a small office as ours, it requires the collaboration with a larger infrastructure. So I think the most important aspect of this type of projects lies in almost in the continuity of the public space or the idea of public space and how the presence or the iconicity of projects have to do with the way that they're actually built as public grounds. So regardless what the actual development is. So in this case, it had to do with how to organize a building that actually will have to create its own context in a way, because it's the first project in that area to have that density. So we departed from an existing building that is still its own site, which is the Reef, and assuming that for, not for contextual reasons, but also for facing reasons, there will have to be almost like public engagement, but also private maneuvering and stewardship of the land. So we had to be quite strategic about the distribution of mass in the site to locate high-rise buildings to maximize views towards downtown. So we also had to create the highest level of contrast between the kind of low-rise buildings that acted much more as a sort of texture in the ground, even though they were 5 stories tall, in the opposite direction than the towers have. But also to maximize the use of construction systems. In this case, we use stick construction versus the concrete podium to allow for a certain looseness in this new fabric of housing that began to create variation and discontinuity and continuity as well. Not just on the podium, but also at the level of the whole urban fabric. So. And I think, most importantly, the idea of connecting, across 2 residential blocks, but connecting also commercial and cultural activities. There is a small museum, and that is at the end, a small museum and a hotel at this end. And of course, all trying to align them in order to conceive the highest degree of continuity and promote at the same time a sense of diversity and unity in the whole. So these are not necessarily things that developers or corporate offices are necessarily deeply preoccupied with. These are our own preoccupations, and this is what I think we managed to bring to this project with certainly changes. Not just the architecture, but also the way how this project begins to act as a catalyst for future developments in that region. Touching quickly on the towers, there are 2 residential towers of condos, a hotel of around 250 keys, and a whole portion of apartments for rent. There will be restaurants and amenities, and also all the showrooms that are still promoted within the Reef, which is existing building. So we presented, or the project presents 3 different datums that in a way, operate across the entire complex, and we did so in order to almost produce 2 different families of forms. One that would actually take the stacking and really work this condition by muting all the sides, and allowing maybe for other facades to start to be more legible. This is also maybe the beauty of working with the oblique plan or the oblique elevation that actually begin to promote that kind of ideas, and which we think that this adds almost the necessary diversity and continuity at the same time in the project. So, and of course, this is one of the views that we like the most because of this, presenting these different relationships between parts that otherwise would be completely separated. The project is still going is still in the city, it's going through entitlement. It's been there for 25 months already, so, but yeah, it's due to come out at some point. We need to cut the recording now. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. We'll take questions. I think if the way the 100 people leave. Questions?
Mm-hmm.
You were
Yes.
making an attempt to change the typology of how certain things look.
Sorry, can you start? Yeah, hold on one second.
Is it on?
It is.
No, it's not on.
Or no? Is there a red light
Yes.
Okay, cool. The approach I see, you're attempting to change the typology of like how things, how buildings look, and you are making these like very formal gestures. Like, is there like a method behind like how far you move back certain, like the beginning slides, the buildings that you were showing?
The building in Argentina.
Huh?
The building in Argentina, the apartment building.
The apartment building, then
The house and
the
yeah.
houses, like you, like, is there like a method behind how far you come back, or are you implying certain? There's one I saw that towards the entrance you turned in, and at the corner you also turned in because the streets turned as well. Like, is there a reason why you are doing that?
Well, the idea of challenging those typologies, I mean, of course, as I said, I mean, they're very strong in their own definition. They have been already studied forever, and and there is a reason for why they work. But then, I mean, the idea of challenging them has to do with like maybe promoting new relationships between the parts. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that there is a specific method behind that. It's just, I mean, about like looking at, I mean, what are the components that participate in that project at that specific moment in time, and then see how we can maybe push for these, I mean, for novel relationships between these different parts. So the idea of the, like for example, in the apartment building, taking the known typology of how balconies operate in general, that they're just, I mean, an extension of the slab, and they're completely disassociated from the life and the experience of the apartment. We try to completely involve them. I mean, the fact that, I mean, that formally maybe, I know there is an argument behind that. I mean, I think that's on a side to the idea of now, I mean, this new set of relationships that are established through elements that otherwise the typology might not necessarily connect. Again, is that about, I mean, maybe let me rephrase it. Are you talking about the translation of, I mean, some of the formal ideas or organizational ideas that we had and how they translated into the different modes of construction in the different buildings? No.
No.
Maybe you can buy the book and then you can.
The answer should always be no.
Yeah.
More questions? Yeah, I'm going to go Ted first, but then very close.
Can I sit now?
Thank you, Georgina. Great lecture. I want to go back to the project in Lima in the context of your, we'll say, your projective practices generally, and I mean quite literally the way the office projects from elevations and sections, the kind of what I would call a projected elevation. You have a different term for it. I was really struck in the project for Lima, the ways in which you're making quite ambiguous what constitutes the ground. And so I guess my question has to do with ways in which the office implicates the ground into the problem and project of patterns.
Yeah, that's a really good question because, I mean, when, or if thinking about some of the parameters that are, when trying to conceptualize some of the interests that we have in the office and this idea of a certain autonomy, like from the building to the ground. I mean, that's in a way one attitude, but that doesn't mean that it's completely disengaging it. And I think like in the case of the project of in Lima, there is still the attempt to try to disengage the building from the ground, but yet, and by like conceiving all these voids around the building, yet, I mean, in a way that emphasizes the attitude towards the ground. So I think the idea of the autonomy of the object, or the autonomy from the ground, in a way, I mean, just operates at a level where it forces us to actually have an attitude towards that. How much we engage the ground, I think it differs on the context, it differs on the type of project, but it's extremely important in what we do. I don't know if that answers the question.
You mentioned a lot of projects that in context or typology aspect, but you also talk about the discussion of what is the real. So is that one of the inspiration or interest of your office? And if that's so, then how does it play out in actual building projects?
Interesting question. I mean, I wouldn't reduce the notion of the real to real projects. I think the idea of, for example, when working on that last piece that I showed from the Chicago Biennale, I mean, actually that's even like more real than maybe anything else, in the sense of how it's using absolutely all the parameters of what that image is promoting. I mean, an image as a real image of a real site with a real context. And, but I think there is always, like to us, there is a deep interest in the dichotomy that is produced by, like for example, like most of the projects that we are working on that hopefully are gonna move into construction very soon, we had the need of producing a oblique drawing that in a way would step back and say, well, I mean, the drawing is not so real because, I mean, there are many things, there are many relationships that you begin to perceive through that projection that are actually not perceived if looking at it specifically from the reality of the building. So there is this economy in terms of going back and forth between the real and the fictional, but yet the roles, in a way, they are exchangeable. Like in some cases, what is real becomes a fictional and the other way around. So that's for us our way to also continue to connect the work that we do with a context that is much larger than the building itself. And that comes with a world of ideas and being able to conceptualize some of the work that we are producing.
Could I follow up on that? Because I can ask maybe ask a question too. I think this is really a super important question, especially given in the committee a little over halfway through the lecture, you raise the specter of, let's say, after the financial crisis and all of these pressures that are, let's say, impacting architecture, you make the suggestion that we don't want to go back to deconstructivism or to postmodernism and to a variety of styles that really were associated with a kind of representational architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And a kind of an image-based architecture. And then a little later on you talk about, because it refers to her question about the real, you show a postmodern, as you call it, a kind of cartoonish representation of a cloud, photograph of a cloud, and then a point kind of a point cloud, abstraction of a cloud. And you say that all of those are real. And so when you, then in your talk, I'm assuming that by real you mean more than simply it's a real project. You mean there's some other kind of philosophical, aesthetic set of problems that are being engaged that refer to this digression to homo decon, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if that has anything to do with how a firm that, let's say, is engaged in very experimental, formal manipulation and development gets connected to SOM or to Gensler. Because Gensler and SOM don't want to collaborate with someone who is, say, doing something not adventuresome or not formally interesting or engaging, I'm assuming. So,
Well, we're fighting with them every day,
yeah.
so.
That's good. So I'm just speculating that there may be some connection here because a lot of what you show in your own, let's say, competition projects are really beautiful and exquisite, but they're not. Many of them are not done. But they throw up some possibilities that then get connected to the real of work with SOM, Gensler, etc. This is
Yeah, because I wouldn't again I wouldn't talk about, as you said, the real, in at least in the way that I'm articulating or presenting the work, has anything to do with the actual context of the real building. I think it has to do with constraints that are that they are real in their own right. So that's why the photograph of the oblique piece, that's as real as it can get, even though there's nothing real about it in the sense that it doesn't belong to any other realm than that as a piece that now a museum owns. That's it. So I think the idea of constantly challenging the relationship between constraints that are, and that's, I guess, what the incredible experience of working with these large offices have, brought to us, that of course, they will get rid of us in a second. If they could do it, they can't, so that's why we're still there. But then the fact that, we are always, trying to push for ideas that maybe, it would be so easy and so feasible to execute, but in a way they belong to maybe a realm that nobody else is used to. So as long as that's not part of their parameters or their constraints, then it's somebody else's problem, theirs. Hi.
You use global at the beginning to describe some of the, maybe it's the office, right? And then you start showing different projects in different parts of the world and also with different realities. So I was trying to, I want to ask you if, as an office, you change the design method when you are in different realities, or if just, or as an office, you just try to adapt to different materials and technologies, but the main idea of the design is always the same.
Well, we adapt, and that's, what I was trying to present also when I introduced some relationships between nature and the vernacular, for example. But the vernacular is something that, in a way, it's present everywhere. That it's, in every place that we are going to intervene. I wouldn't say that the ideas are always the same. I think there is a lineage in the work that we produce. And then the challenges of, sometimes we are offered to produce projects in different contexts or environments, and so it's about how you negotiate some of those ideas with the local technologies, with the vernacular, with what's present on the site. But then there are principles and interests that are actually much larger than that project. So, but that's something that evolves. I couldn't say, how or when or what's the rhythm from which they take place, but that's part of the I think, the quite cohesive lineage of work that we have produced from the beginning. Doesn't mean that all the projects will look the same by any means, but I think these are principles that have been of deep interest for us.
More questions? Oh my, just scream.
I mean, we usually, and this is also just part of the methodology of the office, which actually is an interesting exercise that I usually bring up to my students. The fact of like how you have to be able to convey maybe different messages, like through the image, or how the image allows you for maybe a slightly different narrative of the project, depending on the audience that image is being presented. So it's, we just choose the audience that we want to work for at a given moment. And then, and of course, the first audience is ourselves. So those are usually the images that we produce, but then of course sometimes we need to negotiate, renderings or images that you showed to one of these development clients might not be maybe the same oblique, maybe drawings that might not be too legible for them. So there is something that, like in a way, it forces you to still, be able to be consistent with your ideas and with the narrative of the project, yet in a way you have to change the vocabulary, because as you say, images are like moving everywhere, they move very fast, and of course, you are accountable for all of them too, regardless what that audience is.
Georgina is visiting Critic this semester, so she will be here off and on, and down below if you need to, if you want to drop and maybe
Absolutely.
Otherwise, I'll be back for it, and
Thank you. Thanks again.